Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to wait a moment for our waiting room to come into the meeting. I'm just going to get underway here in just a moment. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce 2021 Federal Candidate Forums. First thing I want to tell you today is that the session is being recorded and it's going to be posted to our website later in the week. We also want to thank Rogers TV for recording the series, and each session is going to air on Rogers TV Channel 10 in Fredericton region at 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. on the day following the recording. And all four of our sessions will run twice consecutively on Saturday, beginning at 1 p.m. and again at 6 p.m. So check out their website for more details. In order to facilitate the taping today, we would ask that you turn off your camera, and that'll help us to get good screenshots for our recording. We really appreciate that. So my name is Krista Ross. I'm CEO here at the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce, and this week we are virtually hosting 4 of the candidates in the Fredericton riding. You can still register for the 2 upcoming forums on our website, and we're going to place a link to that in the chat. We really appreciate the participation of the candidates. We know their schedules are quite full from morning until night, and especially this week as we approach Election Day on Monday. I would also encourage everyone to visit the website wechoosegrowth.ca, where you can check out a set of federal business priorities, which is a collaboration between Chambers of Commerce in Fredericton, St. John, and Moncton, as well as the New Brunswick Business Council, the Conseil économique de Nouveau-Brunswick, and the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association. And the link to that website will also appear in your chat. So today, I'm very pleased to welcome Nicola Byrne. She's the candidate for the Green Party of Canada. And after I introduce Nicole, she's going to provide some opening comments, and then we're going to follow that with a Q&A. We've already had some member questions submitted in advance, and I'm also going to take questions typed into the chat box, and we'll do our very best to get through as many of them as we can in the hour that we have today. Please note, only Nicole and myself will have our mics unmuted during the forum. And without further ado, I'll introduce Nicole. Nicola Byrne, PhD, is an associate professor of the Faculty of Law at UNB, where she has taught Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations, Canadian federalism, criminal law, and evidence since 2009. She has served in professional executive roles at the national level, including Vice President of the Canadian Association of Law Teachers and President of the Canadian Law and Society Association. She served 2 terms as an elected faculty representative on UNB's Board of Governors, and she currently serves as an elected faculty representative on the UNB Senate, the legal representative of the UNB Research Ethics Board, the vice president of the Fredericton Legal Advice Clinic, and as representative on the Law Society of New Brunswick's Truth and Reconciliation Education Committee. Nicole is a certified Lean Six Sigma champion. She's earned a certificate in University Culture and Governance from the Canadian Association of University Business Officers. And before joining UNB Law in 2009, she clerked at the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal and was a member of the Saskatchewan Bar. Nicole grew up in a farm family in southern Saskatchewan, and she currently lives with her husband, Greg Erickson, in Skyline Acres. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Nicola Byrne.
Unmuted. Okay, can people hear me now? All right. Yeah, my backdrop was supposed to do a better job of camouflaging my messy academic office, but I see that I have failed in that regard, so you'll just have to tolerate that. I'll blame my husband or something. I have a few slides to share, but thanks for reading the bio, so I can skip some of the information that's on the slides. Let's get at it here. Share my screen. Okay, folks, United Nations basically says we've got 8 years to act in a very concerted way to turn the climate change emergency around. And that means we need to get past partisan politics. We need to start working together in a much more meaningful way. We can no longer see the Canadian Constitution as an obstacle. We have to use it as a way to generate new possibilities and to really tackle this from every level of government. So I'm running for a member of parliament because I want to be part of those conversations at the federal level, but more importantly, working with local businesses, working with municipal governments, working with provincial governments, so that we can all go together in the same direction here, because we actually don't have any more time to think about responding to the climate emergency. We really need to act. We need to act effectively soon. Okay, let's see here. There we go. Okay, so who am I? Beyond the bio, beyond the law professor, I have 3 dogs, and I'm really in this because of David Kuhn and what he's been able to do in the Legislative Assembly over the last 7 years. It's been remarkable to see someone who represents his constituents of all stripes, of all political persuasions, in an effective way. And he's really convinced me, and I did work on his 2014 campaign, that we can do politics differently if we want to. Okay, so I'm in this to work with people like him who see government as a way that we can tackle big problems like healthcare, like the housing crisis, climate crisis, of course, and then affect meaningful change with respect to reconciliation and Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. So I do kayak, I do support the Reds. There we are. We'll keep moving here. I am from Saskatchewan. I grew up in a small family farm. My dad saw the writing on the wall, and he said there's no future for the small family farm in Saskatchewan. So he really strongly encouraged my brother and I both to go to university. We're both lawyers, we're both professors. And what I learned from my father, who was a very staunch progressive conservative, I met Brian Mulroney when I was a kid. My dad was very, very politically active. I door knocked my first campaign with him when I was 9 years old. So what I learned from my dad was that you've got to get involved in your local community. You've got to make sure that what you're involved with benefits the community and not somebody else. So my dad was a huge proponent of cooperatives, credit unions, like a lot of Saskatchewan farmers. That's just kind of the background we look at. But when it comes to economic development, that's just beyond co-ops and credit unions, but it's about a belief that people who are generating growth, generating economic opportunity, should be able to reinvest those profits in a way that benefit the local community. And I know that a lot of business owners, especially the small business owners here at Fredericton, share that belief. So again, you've heard my bio. So just very briefly, my father invested in my university education. I worked in coffee shops and donut shops and all sorts of things in high school to raise the money to go off to university. And then I just kept going. I have been called a professional student many times in my life. Very happy to get a tenure track job here at UNB. But what I've been studying for the last 20, 25 years is Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. But in the context of the Constitution, natural resources and economic development. So there's some constitutional scholars out there, I'd say the majority, who are really political philosophers, and they do a lot of theory. I'm on the other side of the equation. I'm always talking about cost sharing, funding formulas, money. The Constitution ultimately is about who has the jurisdiction to raise the tax revenue or to make the decisions with respect to a local area. So I'm definitely, maybe it's the farm background, but I'm definitely a pragmatist when it comes to constitutional law. My students are a little bit tired of me talking about politics and money, but that's, folks, where the action is, in my opinion. I have done a lot of professional development since becoming a professor. There's 2 examples right there. And I think it's really important to see the university as part of the business community here in Fredericton and the province of New Brunswick, because it is such, the economic impact of the university is so profound. And now I sound like someone who's been on the Board of Governors for 6 years, but I ran for the Board of Governors so that I could be part of that conversation, so that the university and its community could work better together. So I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the Q&A. So here's where I've been since 2009, the law school. And what do I teach? I teach these courses: Canadian federalism, Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations, et cetera, et cetera. My research interests, like I've said, are really not about theory. There is some of that, of course, but it's really about how do we actualize Canadian federalism for the greater good, okay? And that often has a very profound economic aspect to it. Okay, so here's some of my professional experience. Again, Krista read it out the bio, so I will not belabor this. But I have been involved in national organizations at a leadership level. And then I think it's really important to represent people. So this is my first time running for federal politics. It's certainly not my first time representing people. So I've had, about 20 years involved in student politics and about 10 years being on University Senate and the Board of Governors, and then through some national organization as well. I also sit on a number of boards. I think that's all really important because you get to know your community and how to represent them. And I am not shy about raising questions or raising the difficult issues, hopefully with some constructive aims in mind. But sometimes you have to be the person to step up and ask the tricky questions. So here's basically why I'm running. My students got together soon after the floor crossing and sent me an email. I could paraphrase basically like that. Maybe you should stop teaching and start doing. My average 25-year-old law student is a little bit tired of us 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds talking a lot and not actually doing very much. So they basically challenged me, and I thought they were being very cheeky and forward, but I thought about it for a couple of weeks and I thought, geez, there's no reason I'm not doing this. So here I am, and hopefully going to convince you that I'm a good option on September 20th. All law is political, folks. That's one of the main things I teach my students. And we need to explain the Fredericton and New Brunswick situation to the folks in Ottawa so that policy is created better, that funding formulas work more to our advantage. Right now, because Ottawa is quite tone deaf to the regions and specifically tone deaf to the needs of Atlantic Canada, in my opinion, when we get our policies that don't really work. I'll give you an example. Healthcare funding formula. It's based on per capita. Stephen Harper made that change about 15 years ago. It doesn't take into account the demographic realities of New Brunswick, where we have an older, less healthy population. So that funding formula right from the beginning means that we are a step back from the other provinces when it comes to healthcare funding. And when they started Medicare in this province in the late 1960s, the federal government put in almost 90% of the cost sharing dollars because New Brunswick just didn't have the infrastructure to get that program going. I'd argue, and now we're about 20%. I'd argue that we really need a boost up here. We all know that the healthcare system in this province is in crisis. It doesn't need to be. We need a fair and equitable funding formula. And that's about changing the political conversation so people understand the essence of that, the demographic reality, but then the funding formula inequity. All right, we've got to move on climate change, folks. Healthcare is an issue, affordable housing is an issue, but this is kind of the granddaddy of them all. This is the meta issue. We need to start working on this. I believe strongly that the Green Party, I mean, I'm not running to be prime minister here, okay? I'm not running to be cabinet minister. I'm running to put their feet to the fire and get on the floor of the House of Commons and ask the key questions that need to be asked, and then hold the government accountable. We have never met a climate change target in the history of our country. It's time we need to start taking this seriously. And I want to be the one on the floor of the House of Commons asking questions, but also in the media. And if I can win this seat, there will be continued national media attention. I've done so many interviews the last month, I can't even begin to tell you, but people are interested in what we have to say, and having a Green Party representative brings in a different perspective, and the media are very interested in that. So that's why I'm running, folks, to give a voice to our concerns here in this area. Because it's no longer okay for the federal government to say, well, we'd like to act, but the provinces have jurisdiction, and then the provinces say, well, we could do something, but the federal government says we can. And so, of course, all the carbon tax pricing issues went to court on several reference cases. I teach those in my classes. And now with the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals Saskatchewan here in this judgment in front of you, says that climate change is one of the great existential issues of our time. Judges are not known for their radical politics, but even they have recognized that it's time to break down the barriers that are seen to surround Canadian federalism get past that and allow the federal government to take some very strong steps to enforce measures that will attack the climate change emergency directly. So no longer can provinces say, well, we'd like to, but we don't have the jurisdiction. That's all been cleaned up by courts on these reference cases. However, then do we actually manifest the public policy? That's the step we're in right now, and that's the conversation I'd like to be part of in Ottawa. Because we need to connect the dots, folks, right? The business community, the academic community, you know, everyone needs to come together to tackle this problem because of its enormity, complexity, and significance, right? So there's things we can do, right? Clean technology offers so many opportunities, right? And so many entrepreneurs are already just trying to get into this area or have made steps and have run into problems with onerous government regulation or oversight where the legislation does not permit what they would like to do. I'll give you an example, right? With Hydro New Brunswick, New Brunswick Power, you can maybe put some power into the grid, but you can't actually use that power to pay off the infrastructure investment for putting solar panels on your house or using more clean energy technology within your own domestic situation or on your own farm. That's a real problem. Those barriers need to be eliminated. Government needs to be facilitating solution, not being an obstacle to independent entrepreneurial solutions, because we all need to be on board on this. So this is just a slide here that shows some of the opportunities with respect to clean tech, and we could talk about some of those options later in the Q&A. Also, when it comes to Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations, this is a huge opportunity for us not only to benefit from the traditional knowledge that is in Indigenous communities with respect to environmental knowledge, but they're also economic drivers. I'll give you the example of the Member 2 First Nation on Cape Breton. They're one of the biggest employers on the island. They pursue a lot of very environmentally friendly businesses and opportunities by bringing everything together and thinking a lot more holistically. So they are ISO certified. They've got a number of lawyers working for them. Some of them are my former students. They're putting together deals here, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Clearwater deal with the Mi'kmaq Coalition. So these kind of opportunities that bring us all together as treaty people are really an economic opportunity. I know they're scary because the constitutional issues and everything seems so complex, but ultimately we all want clean water opportunities for our children, good education, good healthcare, and whatnot. And some First Nations are really taking the first steps to having really meaningful economic development that brings prosperity to their local communities. And we can all learn from one another when it comes to doing that. Here's another example, property assessed clean energy programs. So if you do want to retrofit your house or go to a more passive energy usage, this is happening in other jurisdictions. It's not happening in New Brunswick. There's some obstacles there that I would like to see dissolve. So property owners can sign up for these programs. They get the funds, and then they can use those funds to retrofit their house and then pay back the utility or pay through property tax and whatnot. So there's all sorts of like legislative and regulations and programs that can be brought into force to help us meet some of these targets with respect to carbon tax reduction, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. What we need to do here, though, because in Fredericton, we have so much action happening through, I mean, the Chamber of Commerce here is very, very active. So Planet Hatch, Ignite Fredericton, we need to plug into our local ecosystem of businesses, our local ecosystem of the university, right? Knowledge, tech, all these things can come together to help us provide some solutions or new directions to the climate crisis that's facing us, okay? So there's a lot going on the ground. And as MP, I'd like to be the person that makes sure that the right people are talking to the right people and that things that are seen to be obstacles could maybe dissolve and maybe bring forward different opportunities. So that's what I see my role as a member of parliament. You don't need to be a member of the governing party to do that job, okay? So of course, my mom's very happy with this endorsement. So she insisted that I put it up. So here we are, David Suzuki. Of course, I spent my whole childhood watching the nature of things and whatnot. So when this came out yesterday, I was pretty thrilled. So there's my little promo. And of course, why should you vote for me? I'll give you a few reasons here, folks. One, I bring discipline to the job. I know how to put in a big day of work, and I am completely devoted to our community here in Fredericton and making sure that our perspectives are on the table in Ottawa. Expertise, I have spent the last 25 years studying Canadian federalism, cost sharing agreements, funding formulas, Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. I'm ready to go. I know enough to ask the right questions. And I'm really committed to citizen engagement and getting out there and hearing what people such as yourself have to say. I have a lot of media experience. And here are some of my values. They align with the Green Party, but I think they align with a lot of folks these days who've experienced flooding, who've experienced climate change in their own personal lives. We need to move forward, but we need to do it as a community, and we need to talk to one another. We also need to get past such harsh partisanship. We need to get past that, and we need to get past some of these jurisdictional boundaries between federal, provincial, and municipal governments to work together, because the problems facing us are huge when it comes to climate change. But what we've seen coming out of COVID is that when things are important, we can all come together, we can find new ways to do things, we can find new solutions. And that's why I'm involved in politics. I think our time now is to start thinking imaginatively, creatively, all together to tackle the issues that face us. And I think we can do it. So there, green grows back. Vote Nicole. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen. I will get ready for some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for your presentation today and for sharing your slides with us. And it was great to hear your discussion, talking about the economy, talking about community engagement and small businesses, and your awareness of the ecosystem that we all work in here in Fredericton. So, and great to hear what you're passionate about and your background. So I want to start with some questions that relate specifically to the small business community. I want to know, what is your party's plan with respect to CERB and enhanced EI? The current programs, some say, give a disincentive to work or a disincentive to return to work, and they are also a financial burden to taxpayers.
Yeah, well, I guess that's me too much of a Pollyanna here, or too much of an optimist, but we've seen that when you remove anxiety from people's lives, like where's my next rent check coming from? How am I going to pay the next grocery bill? That they can actually focus on other things. So to a certain extent, programs like CERB or EI or welfare, or however you want to call it, address that kind of anxiety that people have. And so we need to deal with it. Now, the problem with CERB and some of the other federal programs that were recently introduced is that they were not well thought out. They were blanket programs. They were too universal. They weren't subtle. They weren't nuanced in any way. And so you hear all those stories of the teenager collecting CERB or the university students here. So things are really uneven. That's just a symptom of poorly designed public policy. So one of the classes I teach is called evidence. So when you're making public policy, you got to build it on evidence. And they just didn't, in my opinion, with respect to those programs. But now they've tried them. Okay, let's actually try to rethink what those are doing and what they are accomplishing, and not just get stuck in the mindset that they were either good or bad, should be eliminated or increased. But let's actually study it a bit more and see what's effective, because there were some good things coming out of that experiment under duress, if you would, because of COVID. But we should really think about guaranteed livable income and whatnot, because it does eliminate a lot of the basic problems that people have facing, grocery, how do they pay their rent, and all those kind of things.
Can certainly appreciate the answer that you've provided. One comment I would make is that June of 2019 to June of 2021, there are currently, or there were an additional 30,000 people not participating in the workforce and collecting either EI or CERB or some form of support. So the challenge is, although it may alleviate a lot of that anxiety that you speak of, very difficult labor market for the small businesses. And that leads me to my next question. We hear a lot about the hardest hit industries. So what measures would your party seek to enact to assist or support those hardest hit, or the tourism industry, restaurants, those types of industries? How would you help them get back on their feet?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, everybody's struggling to figure out what kind of policies where government can play a role. And I mean, a lot of people who have been very skeptical about the government's ability to even play that kind of role might be warranted, given how slowly sometimes governments react to some of these crises. When it comes to tourism industry, you know, I think we have to be careful that we don't just assume that everybody's suffering the same problems, right? And so where are the studies? Where are the applications? Where is the programming funding and whatnot? So a lot of it's communications, because there are pots of money already available, because industries like tourism are generally cyclical in nature and have real ups and downs, like the farming business that I came out of, right? It's very, very unpredictable. So you've got to build in some safety nets there. So if there is a good year, that companies can kind of put some money away or invest it and not be afraid that it's all going to be taken by the government, right? So they can offset some of the worst years. Now, what we've seen is very extreme, of course, because of COVID, but the same principles still apply. And so governments need to be very attuned to what the actual needs are. And I haven't seen a whole lot of nuanced policy response from either our provincial government or our federal government with respect to what do these entrepreneurs or the tourism industry owners, what do they actually need, right? So that's, of course, step one. And people like organizations like the Chamber of Commerce have done a fairly effective job of articulating what those needs are, but there seems to be quite a bit of drag time between what the government actually comes up with respect to policy and then the needs on the ground. So what we saw during COVID was a lot of businesses just couldn't keep things going for more than 6 or 8 months, right? Like there's just the crunch just happened and the government just was not responsive enough. So we really have to work on ways to focus on getting that information in quicker, not so much government bureaucracy, not so much red tape. And the Green Party does have a much more individualistic focus on entrepreneurship, et cetera. So basically it's keep the government out of the way when we don't need them, but when they're there, when we do need them, make sure that the policies and programs they're putting in place are actually what's needed, right? And not just what some bureaucrat thinks industry needs, but to actually get the right inputs from industry to help design public policy that is a lot more effective. And I don't see a whole lot of that going on. I know the Greens are very, very actively concerned about working with small businesses and entrepreneurs to get people into renewables, right? And how do we actually incentivize individual companies to actually take on more green projects or to get into those kind of businesses and whatnot. So a lot more individual focus, a lot more on the ground, and dare I say, maybe grassroots, right? Talk to people, it's important.
That is important, knowing what your customer wants and satisfying them in a way that works for them. I will tell you one thing that most businesses are telling us that they do need, and an area where they're struggling is with regards to workforce. So industries, whether they be retail, tourism, hospitality, IT, there's tons of industries that are having trouble attracting workers. So how do you believe that we can boost the available workforce in New Brunswick?
Well, we've seen an interesting test case here is that if you give people something like CERB and they've got a baseline and it no longer makes sense for them to work, given what they have to pay out in childcare, right? Just to give you an example. So where governments could play a role, right? We gotta get childcare figured out, right? We're keeping women out of the labor force because it doesn't make sense for them to have a minimum wage job and then have to turn around and pay almost the same amount in childcare so they can work. So you see a lot of people removing themselves from the workforce. That's just one example. So again, we have to try to see where government policy can plug in to support industry, not replace it, but to use those programs to actually facilitate economic development and the drivers that actually work, right? So right now, I mean, and I'm going to keep talking about childcare here because that's the most obvious example of how it often doesn't make sense for a woman to be in the workforce when her opportunities are so limited by the outputs she has to put in to childcare, et cetera. It just doesn't make sense. So we have to look at that calculus and make sure that the economic factors are a little more balanced. So people entering the workforce, it actually makes sense for them to enter the workforce because I think people are rational actors. And if financially it doesn't make sense to work the minimum wage job and to turn around and give it all to the lady down the street who's taking care of your kids, you're gonna stay out. I need to work on that.
Another area that we hear in terms of attracting workforce would be related to housing availability and affordability. So how would your government work with the provincial, territorial or municipal governments to address that issue? Would you implement a national housing roundtable with all levels of government? What would you do?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the reasons I'm running is that my husband, who's the deputy mayor of Fredericton, when we were campaigning to get him reelected for a third term, and of course I'm his campaign manager for all of this, we were door knocking in Ward 8, that's Skyline Acres and Forest Hill. And every second or third house, people were talking about rents or talking about housing prices. A lot of the older, especially the older ladies, were saying, I'm on a fixed income, I have a fixed pension, my property tax assessment's going through the roof, I'm really worried that I won't be able to stay in my home. Talk about anxiety, that's a lot of anxiety for people. So people were asking my husband, well, what can the city do, right? And what we saw with that whole city motel fiasco, I'm sure Greg wouldn't be happy with me using that word, but I think it was a fiasco, was that the city can only do so much. They have a very limited tax base. They have very limited jurisdictional authority. So they can do a little bit here and there on the edges, but they certainly cannot get into building development and all this kind of stuff, right? So what we saw in the city motel business was a lack of communication, too much partisanship between the federal and provincial governments, and then the municipal government is kind of left not being able to implement much because the levels of government need to work together. The federal government's got the spending power. They've already got the money, right? The provincial government deals with the jurisdictional issues and whatnot with when it comes to housing, social development, and all those kind of issues. They need to work together, okay? And when they don't, you get housing crises, and that's what we're seeing. So one of the things that I'm proposing here and through the Green Party is that the federal government, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, used to be in the property development business. Over the last 30 years, they've just kind of, they've stepped back from actually building to more just kind of subsidizing private builds. But through World War II and after, and if you're familiar with the Adobe houses here in Fredericton, all those little wartime housing limited houses were built by the federal government to address a housing crisis that was caused by World War II, right? But we arguably have a housing crisis right now. So the money that's going into the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which is a large amount of money, a lot of it is not being used, okay, because it's just not being accessed properly, or there's partisanship or all sorts of bureaucratic red tape. But the federal government could go back into the housing business on that wartime housing limited model. The benefit too would be you could build those houses up to 2021 housing specifications when it comes to environmental standards, right? So there are possibilities, and I know people are going to say, well, where's the money going to come from and whatnot? The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation is already putting hundreds of millions of dollars into housing. Let's redivert that and make it more effective and direct directly address the need that's happening on the ground, because in Fredericton, we have a very, very serious problem on our hands.
I have a couple of more housing questions that I'd like to keep the questions and answers brief because we have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm just going to quickly ask you, how would you intend to support first-time home buyers or newcomer home buyers that are struggling to find housing and resources? Would you look at relaxing mortgage stress tests? Would you look at restoring 30-year mortgages?
Yeah, there's some room for some mortgage. Well, it hasn't been reviewed for a long time, right? Again, we've got the law and the incentives and the public policy running right way behind the needs, right? So I guess we're paying attention in Fredericton now because we always thought a housing problem was Calgary's problem or Toronto's problem, but now that we're facing it here, it's become very real for people. And what do we actually do? So if, again, here I was door knocking with Greg in the spring, what do people actually want? And they do want reform when it comes to mortgages. And again, that comes back to the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which hasn't really changed the way it operates for a generation or two. And they need to be more nimble. They need to really understand what the need is and then put some money in to support first-time home owners, and so that people can actually afford to get into the housing market. I'll leave it there because I know there's lots of questions.
So when we talk about attracting labor and housing and those types of issues, another issue that makes it challenging sometimes for people to move to this jurisdiction is healthcare. And you already mentioned that you do agree that federal health transfers should be I guess, weighted to account for aging populations and so on. Yesterday, the Canadian Medical Association released a public opinion poll saying that Canada's healthcare system is the #1 area that requires federal investment. So how would you address the health system challenges facing New Brunswick?
Yeah, when I first moved here in 2009, I was quite surprised to find out that although New Brunswick provincial government under Louis Robichaud was the first Canadian province to support Medicare. Okay. And there's this wonderful picture in the archives of Louis Robichaud and Lester Pearson having a lobster dinner, and they're both holding up this giant lobster. Looks like it's about 12 or 15 pounds or whatever. But then New Brunswick is the last Canadian province to sign on to Medicare. And I found that to be a really interesting story. So I ended up interviewing a lot of former civil servants. I wrote a paper with the co-author of the Romanow Commission report on healthcare about why New Brunswick was the first to sign on, but the last to implement. And the issue is, and I guess I have a nose for this or whatnot, it was money, right? So even when the federal government's putting out 50-50 cost sharing dollars, trying to entice provinces to implement public policy, for a province like New Brunswick, 50-cent dollars are still really expensive. So the federal government actually put in almost 90% of the dollars to get Medicare going in New Brunswick. And then the last 20, 25 years, the numbers have just decreased. It's fallen off the cliff now, so it's almost like 20%. And that's just not enough, because it's the same realities that are facing New Brunswick now that faced us in the late 1960s when Medicare was first implemented. An older population, less healthy population, can't do this on per capita because it's too much of a strain. We don't have the local bureaucracy or the administrative structures to deal with it. Those factors are still in place. The federal government has just been blind to this and moved us into this cookie cutter formula. The Harper government did us no favors putting us into the per capita, because our healthcare needs in New Brunswick are profoundly different than other Canadian provinces. So what do we need to do? Yeah, we need to actually look at the Romanow Commission. Yes, I'm a big fan of my co-author's role in that report as the director. We know what a lot of the problems are. We need to implement them. And that gets us back to political will. As a country, do we think that healthcare should be based on need or the ability to pay? And over again, we see that Medicare is the #1 defining issue, saying as a nation who we are, we care about people. COVID has just reinforced the need for a very healthy, quote unquote, robust public health services for everyone that are also accessible to all. We need to really get the federal government to put its money where its mouth should be with respect to funding healthcare in New Brunswick. They have failed.
So connecting the dots between healthcare, housing, homelessness, and mental health, how do you see solutions in that regard?
Yeah, well, to bring up the specter of cooperative federalism. Now, I tend to be skeptical of cooperative federalism because I don't think in our history as a country that the federal government, the provinces have all got together and sung songs and been friends with, that friendly with one another, right? There's usually some hardcore negotiations and some interests aligning and whatnot that then bring forward these kind of public policy solutions. So what we really need to do, though, I mean, the Harper government got rid of federal provincial meetings, and for 100 odd years up to that point, the federal government got together with all the provinces. They would share their budget information ahead of the meetings. Then they'd all get together, and the finance people would get together, the health people would get together, social services and whatnot. And they would put together a much more integrated plan for what the federal government and the provinces could do. What we've seen in the last 20, 30 years is a radical decentralization of the Canadian Federation to the point where we don't even have those meetings anymore. Okay, so how are we supposed to have integrated public policy where the federal government has the spending power to put money into programs when they don't meet with the provincial governments to really assess the needs or have the communication that they really need to put together these really complex joint programs, cost sharing, and funding formulas? So that's a problem. We need to really talk, and that's how you connect the dots. It's all about communication and information flow. So I'm proposing something very, very old-fashioned. We go back to old-fashioned federal provincial meetings, sharing of financial information ahead of the civil servants and the bureaucrats get together, and then decisions are actually made for the greater good, like for the whole country, right? So that other regions are not left behind, because arguably New Brunswick, there's a reason why we're facing housing crisis, healthcare crisis, mental health healthcare crisis, is that we've been on the edges and on the periphery too long. We've not been part of national conversations in a meaningful way to address those issues, and that needs to change.
Another issue that impacts our members, our communities, and is a federal issue, as well as a provincial issue. We have a low retention rate for our entrepreneurial immigrants. And although we know the province leads that immigration file for New Brunswick, how would you, if you were our member of parliament, work with the province to ensure that we are supporting and attracting and bringing in those immigrant investors?
Well, once again, when I was campaigning with my husband this spring, I'd say about 10% of Ward 8 are permanent residents and recent immigrants. It might be higher. This is just my anecdotal kind of keeping track on the sheets. And every time we met someone who said, oh, well, we'd love to, but we can't vote, I would ask them, would you vote if you could? And every single person I've asked that question, and now I've been asking that on my campaign as well, has said yes. They want us to come here. We're either students at the university or we come to work in a company or whatnot. We either buy a house or we pay rent or do something. We pay a lot of taxes, but yet we can't vote for our municipal councillor. We have no meaningful say in local government, and they feel alienated by that. They feel that they're not really wanted in this community because they don't have a say. And what's worse is that permanent residents in our province had the vote until the late 1990s, when they were purposefully disenfranchised. So there was a point in our province's history where those people were actually included in the political conversation. They could vote, they could express their feelings in a meaningful way, which is at the ballot box. That's how democracy works. And then we decided to take that away. I think it's very alienating, right? So here we are working on all these immigration strategies and trying to attract and retain people. And when they get here, we do not treat them or their opinions as if they matter. So for me, getting rid of that, and I think it's just an overly enthusiastic interpretation of the charter, section 3, that only Canadians can vote. Well, you know, the charter came in 1982. We didn't enfranchise them till 15 years later. What's going on there that can actually be changed back. Okay, so that's one thing. And as for having programs that attract and retain, I mean, we're never going to be Toronto. I mean, we're never going to be able to compete with Vancouver, Toronto, right, to get immigrants. So what it's going to have to be is when we're attracting somebody, to introduce them to the community. And we're lucky. We do have a very vibrant multicultural association here in Fredericton. We do have a lot of people moving into our communities. And I know that we all get kind of painted with the same brush, that this is a very closed community, right? That New Brunswick's not that very welcoming. But that has not been my experience. And if I can say that I'm an immigrant to New Brunswick, I mean, when I came for my job interview in 2009, they picked me up at the airport. I got wined and dined. I got tours of the school, and I got to sit in on classes and stuff. So from the first minute I was at the airport getting picked up, I was like, oh my God, this is different than any other place I've interviewed. I think they actually want me here, right? We need to keep working on that, the spirit of community and the spirit of welcoming. And guess what? Maritime folks are really good at that, right? So I think institutionally, we need to work on the voting. We also need to put, I mean, organizations like Dialogue NB are really great. We need to continue to fund those and encourage them. But we also need to get at the people who've been living here for generations and convince them why multiculturalism and plurality and diversity is a good thing, right? And have those kind of communications with people. And you know, there's a lot of action happening with the local organizations and churches and whatnot, and to really encourage that, so that people feel that they've come here, but that they've joined a community as well. And that really happens at the university. We get so many international students. I was at an international student welcome barbecue the other day, and they're also thrilled to be in Canada, and they're meeting one another and whatnot. But there weren't a lot of students who weren't the immigrant international students, right? The other thing we can do with students who come to school at UNB is that once they finish their program, why can't we make them Canadian citizens? Why do we make them jump through years of red tape and be stuck in this permanent resident status? I've met people who've been permanent residents for 5, 10, 15 years because the red tape to get your citizenship is so onerous, right? So why don't we work on some programs like that? Because when students have come here and they're doing a master's in business admin or engineering degree or whatnot, they're expressing an intention to stay in Canada, most of them. So let's make it easier for them.
I'm going to jump in with some quick questions right along those lines. One is, would you be in favor of adopting policies that would qualify international students for Canada's Summer Jobs Program and the Student Work Placement Program?
I'm going to just say yes to that, Krista, for all the reasons I hopefully made clear in my last answer. Yes, absolutely, it's a good idea.
How about participating in voluntary co-op terms and internships without having to get a separate work permit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think there's any reason why we can't do that. No one's ever really explained to me why grad students at the university have what they call a 10-hour rule. They can only work off campus 10 hours a week. Well, the way tuitions have gone up, the way grants have diminished over the years, that's not a realistic prospect for a lot of people to only work 10 hours a week, right? So we need to work on some of these other alternatives. I know the university is, but I don't think that there's a real, and I'm speaking here as a former president of a grad student society not so long ago, this was certainly my area, but dealing with international students and how we actually incorporate them into the community in a meaningful way. The universities have to stop just thinking of international students as a cash cow because they pay much higher tuition than domestic students. And they have to start thinking of them as like a nation building project, right? And work with the province and work with the federal government, because this is a great source of immigration. And especially for a province like New Brunswick, that's where we're seeing that people come in to work in the tech sector, to be engineers, to be healthcare workers, et cetera. So we really, I wish I had easier solutions, but universities treating international students as cash cows who are just here for a limited time, we'll take your money and then we don't care what happens to you. That really needs to end. We need to figure out a way for the province, the federal government, and the student governments even, and the university administration to work together better so that those people really are incentivized to stay.
So during COVID, they did change the regulation that they could work more than 20 hours off campus, but we'd like to see that become permanent. How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it should be up to the student to say how much they can work during a week. I mean, some of these limitations, they're paternalistic, and they were formulated in a time long past where 10 hours was considered to be quite a bit of work. Why aren't we judging people on their academic performance, right? Maybe if your grades go down a very significant degree, then maybe you shouldn't be working 30, 40 hours off campus, right? But there's got to be some other metric than just some rigid application of a rule that no longer really makes sense in the current context.
So related to university, and you've mentioned the tech sector, New Brunswick receives about 43% less R&D funding from the federal government versus the national average. How would you as MP seek to close that gap in the next debate?
Well, I know we're running out of time here, so I'll say write a check. How about that? Like I realize people are like, oh, she's just a tax and spend, whatever. No, but why are we getting that much less? That's not 4% less. That's almost 50% less. On what rationale could they possibly have that, especially in a region like Atlantic Canada that so desperately needs that kind of investment? And just to even kind of, we should arguably be getting 143% of the investment that's going to Ontario or Alberta. They don't really need it. We're the ones who need it. Are we not supposed to be one nation with equal opportunity for all? You got to even these things out, make them more equitable, and look at the various situations of the various territories and provinces and First Nations and make that more sense instead of just, the same funding per capita for everyone. It just doesn't make sense. Per capita funding just does not work.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask you a 3-part question, and the length of your closing remark will depend on how long it takes you to answer the 3-part question. So the last question I want to talk to you about today is with regards to fiscal planning. What is your party's plans for pandemic spending in the short term? What federal supports do you think will be needed for economic recovery in the medium term? And finally, how would you manage the growing debt and deficit in the long term?
Okay, well, when it comes to governments and fiscal planning, the number one thing is planning and getting past electioneering and election cycles. What we've seen right now is parties who are intent on bribing us with our own taxpayer dollars, right? They're throwing money around at seniors, they're throwing money around, all sorts of different promises and whatnot. Is that really based on thoughtful public policy, right? Are those levers to incentivize certain behaviors? Is that actually for the greater good? Or is that to get a certain party back into power? We need to get past that. Okay, so when it comes to short-term, medium-term, and then long-term, I'd say the same fundamental principles need to be in place. There needs to be thoughtful budgeting. You need to be very careful about the inputs and outputs, right? Not just start writing checks and having programs that will see how they work. I mean, CERB has been a case study in what not to do, okay? And we need to be a lot more nuanced in these things, but it comes down to governments planning, thinking long term, getting past electioneering, and quit thinking that they can bribe voters with our own money. We are not that dumb. Okay, so maybe it's a 3-part, but I actually see it all part of the same essence, is that governments need to think about the bigger picture. They need to think in 5, 10, 15, and 20-year increments, whether it comes to fiscal planning or creating policy to create effective climate change or effective climate mitigation strategies, or getting into the house building business or whatever. None of this can be done overnight. None of it can be done during an election campaign. We need to get more evidence-based public policy, more thoughtful fiscal planning. I don't see a whole lot of evidence of that from either of the big parties.
So I'm going to ask you to leave everybody with a closing thought, and I guess share your closing remarks with the members of the chamber who have gathered today to hear your Q&A and your presentation. And so I turn the floor to you.
Okay, well, thanks so much for the opportunity. And again, I apologize for the messy office, but I think that's an academic job hazard. I'd like to leave you with a thought here that, you know, when we're thinking about Canadian history, World War II was one of the biggest challenges we faced in the 20th century. We'd come out of a Great Depression. Things were pretty chaotic, but what we were able to do was mobilize. And so if we were mobilizing to actually fight a world war, and what they did in 1943 was they started to think, well, actually, we're going to win this. It's just a matter of how long it takes us to win. They started to plan for peace. So that's where you get unemployment insurance. That's where you get Canada Pension Plan. That's where you get hospitalization insurance and ultimately Medicare. So we've just been through, and we're still in it, a very, very big crisis, a global pandemic. I think if we're thoughtful and we ask the right questions, that we can come out of it like we came out of World War II, thinking differently about what government could do. Can government tackle a housing crisis? Yes, it can. Can they tackle climate change? Yes, by providing the right incentives, by putting together evidence-based public policy, by creating incentives for people to do the right thing, and then to also have enough enforcement and regulation to get at the big polluters, or to get at the toxic landlords, or to get at the people that are causing problems and whatnot. So I guess that's my lasting thought for everyone, is that we've been through something here together the last couple of years that none of us ever thought we would have to live through. And like World War II, we're coming out of this, and this is an opportunity for us to think about these big issues differently, because when we come together, we actually can address these problems in an effective and meaningful way. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this afternoon.
Thank you, Nicole. Nicola Byrne is the Green Party candidate in the federal riding of Fredericton in the upcoming federal election taking place on Monday. I encourage everybody to get out and vote between now and Monday or on Monday. And I want to remind everyone that we do have 2 sessions left in our forum series. Tomorrow at 1 p.m. is Sean Oldenburg. He's the NDP candidate. And Thursday at 1 p.m. is Jenica Atwin, the Liberal candidate. So again, thank you so much, Nicole, for being with us today and for answering so many questions for us and your presentation. I know our members are very appreciative of hearing your opinions and your concerns and your recommendations. So as mentioned before, everybody, this was recorded and will be posted on our website, and Rogers will be sharing it as well. So thanks everyone for attending, and thanks, Nicole.